Hey guys, it's Cassidy again, and I hope you're all doing well. And today we're going to read Part 3 of Cinder by Marissa Meyer. Chapter 6. Cinder slinked through the balmy night, the sound of her boots shuffling across the concrete as if both legs were made of steel. The empty night was a chorus of muted sounds in her head. The sandy crunching of Eco's treads, the sputtering of street lamps above them, the constant hum of the magnetic superconductor beneath the street. With every step, the wrench inside Cinder's calf clinked. It all dulled in comparison to the video replaying in her mind. Her interface did that sometimes, recording moments of strong emotion and playing them over and over, like deja vu or when the last words of a conversation linger in the air long after silence has settled in. Usually she could make the memory stop before it drove her crazy, but tonight she didn't have the energy. The black splash on Peony's skin, her scream, the Medroid's syringe dragging Cinder's blood from the flesh of her elbow. Peony, small and trembling on the gurney, already dying. She stopped, clutching her stomach as her nausea rolled up. Eco paused a few paces ahead, shining her spotlight on Cinder's scrunched face. "Are you all right?" The light darted down the length of Cinder's body, and she was sure Eco was searching for bruise-like rings, even though the Medroid had said she wasn't infected. Instead of answering, Cinder peeled off her gloves and shoved them into her back pocket. Her faintness passing, she leaned her shoulder against a street lamp and drank in the humid air. They'd made it home, almost. The Phoenix Tower apartment stood on the next corner, only the top floor catching the faint light from the crescent moon, the rest of the building cast in shadow. The windows were black but for a handful of lights and some bluish-white glares from flickering net screens. Cinder counted floors, finding the windows to the kitchen and Adri's bedroom. Though dim, the light was somewhere on, in the apartment. Adri wasn't a night person, but perhaps she discovered that Puny was still out. Or perhaps Pearl was awake, working on a school project or calming friends late into the night. It was probably better this way. She didn't want to have to wake them. What am I going to tell them? Eco's sensor was on the apartment building for a moment, then the ground, picking up the shuffled debris along the sidewalk. Cinder rubbed her sweaty palm on her pants and forced herself onward. Try as she might, suitable words would not come out. Explanations, excuses. How do you tell a woman their daughter is dying? She swiped her ID and entered the main door this time. The gray lobby was decorated only with a net screen that held announcements for the residents, a rise in maintenance fees, a petition for a new ID scanner at the front door, a lost cat. Then the elevator, loud with the clunking of old machinery. The hallway was empty save the man from apartment 1807 snooping on his doorstep. Cinder had to tuck in his splayed arm so Eco wouldn't crush it. Heavy breathing and the sweet aroma of rice wine wafted up. She hesitated in front of apartment 1820, heart pounding. She couldn't recall when the video of Puny had stopped repeating in her head, eclipsed by her harsh nerves. What was she going to say? Cinder bit her lip and held up her wrist for the scanner. The small light switched to green. She opened the door as quietly as possible. Brightness from the living room spilled into the dark hallway. Cinder caught a glimpse of the net screen, still showing footage of the market earlier that day, the baker's booth going up in flames again and again. The screen was muted. Cinder entered the room, but halted mid-step. Eco bumped against her leg. Facing her from the middle of the living room were 3 androids with red crosses painted on their spherical heads, emergency medroids. Behind them, Adri in her silk bathrobe stood against the mantel though the holographic fire was turned off. Pearl was still fully clothed, sitting on the sofa with her knees pulled up to her shin. They were both holding dry washcloths over their noses and eyeing Cinder with a mix of repulsion and fear. Cinder's stomach clenched. She drew a half step back into the hallway, wondering which one of them was sick, but she quickly realized that neither of them could be. The androids would have taken them immediately. They wouldn't be protecting their breath. The entire building would be on lockdown. She noticed a small bandage on Adri's elbow. They'd already been tested. Cinder shifted her messenger bag, setting on the ground, but kept the mag belt. Adri cleared her throat and lowered the cloth to her sternum. She looked like a skeleton in the pale light, mealy skin and jutting bones. Without makeup, dark circles swelled beneath her bloodshot eyes. She'd been crying, but now her lips were set in a stiff line. "I received a call an hour ago," she said once the silence had congealed in the room. "It informed me that Puny was picked up from the Taihang district junkyard and taken. Her voice broke. She dropped her gaze, but when she looked up again, her eyes were flashing. But you know that already, don't you? Cinder shifted, trying not to look at the Medroids. Without waiting for Cinder to answer, Adri said, Eco, you can begin disposing of Puny's things. Anything she wore in the past week can go into waste collection, but take it to the alley yourself. I don't want it clogging up the chutes. I suppose everything else can be sold at the market. Her voice was sharp and steady, as if this list had been repeating in her head from the moment she received the news. Eco nodded and wheeled into the hallway. Cinder stayed, frozen, both hands clutching the mag belt like a shield. Though the android was incapable of ignoring Adri's commands, it was clear from her slowness that she didn't want to leave Cinder alone so long as the Medroids were watching them. Why, said Adri, wringing the washcloth, was my youngest daughter at the Taihang District junkyard this evening? Cinder drew the mag belt against her, lining it up from shoulder to toe. Made of the same steel as her hand and equally tarnished, it felt like an extension of fear. She came to me looking for a mag belt. She came with me to look for a mag belt. She drew in a heavy breath. Her tongue felt swollen, her throat closing in. I'm so sorry. I saw the spots and I called the emergency hover. I didn't know what to do. Tears puddled in Adri's eyes briefly before she blinked them away. She dropped her head, staring down at the twisted cloth. Her body sagged against the mantel. I wasn't sure that you would come back here, Cinder. I expected to receive another comment any minute, telling me that my ward had also been taken. These Medroids tested Pearl and myself. The plague has not yet spread to either of us. Cinder started to nod, relieved, but Adri continued. Tell me, Cinder, if Pearl and I are not carrying the disease, where did Puny get it from? I don't know. You don't know, but you did know about the outbreak in the market today. Cinder's lips parted. Of course. The cloths, the Medroids, they thought she wasn't infected. I don't understand you, Cinder. How could you be so selfish? She jerked her head. They tested me too at the junkyard. I don't have it. I don't know where she got it from. They can check again if they want to. One of the Medroids showed its first sign of life, shining the light at the small red spot where the needle had pricked her. But they didn't move, and Adri didn't encourage them. Instead, she turned her attention to a small framed port screen on the mantel, shuffling through pictures of Pearl and Puny in their childhood. Pictures at their old house, the one at the garden, pictures with Adri before she lost her smile, pictures with their father. I'm so sorry, said Cinder. I love her too. Adri squeezed the frame. Don't insult me, she said, sliding the frame closer to her. Do your kind even know what love is? Can you feel anything at all, or is it just programmed? She was talking to herself, but the words stung. Cinder risked a glance at Pearl, who was still sitting on the sofa with her face half hidden behind her knees, but she was no longer holding the washcloth to her face. When she saw Cinder looking at her, she turned her gaze to the floor. Cinder flexed her fingers against the mag belt. Of course I know what love is. And sadness, too. She wished she could cry to prove it. Good, then you understand that I'm doing what a mother must do to protect my children. Adri turned the frame face down on the mantel. On the couch, Pearl turned her face away, pressing her cheek to her knees. A tendril of fear curled in Cinder's stomach. Adri? It has been 5 years since you became part of this household. 5 years since Garen left you to me. I still don't know what made him do it. Don't know why he felt obligated to travel to Europe, of all places, to find some mutant to take care of. He never explained it to me. Perhaps he would have someday, but I never wanted you. You know that. Cinder pursed her lips. The blank-faced Medroids leered up at her. She didn't know it, but she didn't think Adri had ever put it so clearly. Garen wanted you to be taken care of, so I've done my best. Even when he died, even when the money ran out, even when everything fell apart. Her voice cracked, and she pressed one palm firmly against her mouth. Cinder watched her shoulders tremble, listened to the short gasps of breath as she tried to stifle the sobs. But Garen would have agreed. Puny comes first. Our girls come first. Cinder started at the raised voice. She could hear the justification in Adri's tone, the determination. Don't leave me with this thing. She shuddered. Adri, if it weren't for you, Garen would still be alive. And Puny. No, it's not my fault. Cinder spotted a flash of white, saw Ika loitering in the hallway, uncertain. Her sensor had gone nearly black. Cinder searched for her voice. Her pulse was throbbing. I didn't ask to be made like this. I didn't ask for you or anybody to adopt me. This isn't my fault. It isn't my fault either, Adri lashed out, shoving the net screen off its brackets with one shove. It fell and crashed, taking 2 of her husband's achievement plaques down with it. Bits of plastic ricocheted across the worn carpet. Cinder jumped back, but the frenzy fled as fast as it had come. Adri's ragged breath was already slowing. She was always so careful not to disturb the neighbors, not to be noticed, not to do anything that could ruin their reputation, even now. Cinder, said Adri, chafing her fingers with the washcloth, as if she could erase her lost temper. You will be going with these Metroids. Don't make a scene. The floor shifted. What? Why? Because we have a duty to do what we can, and you know that there's a high demand for your type, especially now. She paused. Her face had gone pink and mottled. We can still help Peony. We just need cyborgs to find a cure. You volunteered me for plague research? Her mouth could barely form the words. What else was I to do? Cinder's jaw hung. She shook her head numbly as all 3 sensors focused on her. But nobody survives the testing. How could you? Nobody survives the plague. If you care for Peony as much as you claim to, you will do as I say. If you hadn't been so selfish, you would have volunteered yourself after you left the market today, before coming here and ruining my family. Again. But take her away. She is yours. Cinder was too stunned to move as the nearest android held up a scanner to her wrist. It beeped and she flinched back. Cinder, it said in its metallic voice, your voluntary sacrifice is admired and appreciated by all citizens of the Eastern Commonwealth. A payment will be made to your loved ones as a show of gratitude for your contribution. Her grip tightened on the mag belt. No, that's what this is really about, isn't it? You don't care about Peony. You just wanted the stupid payout. Adri's eyes widened, her lips pulling taut against her skull. She crossed the room in 2 steps, the back of her hand whipping across Cinder's face. Cinder fell against the doorframe and pressed a hand against her cheek. Take her, said Adri. Get out of my sight. I didn't volunteer. You can't take me against my will. The android was unperturbed. You have been authorized by your legal guardian to take you into custody through the use of force if necessary. Cinder curled her fingers, balling a fist against her ear. You can't force me to be a test subject. Yes, said Adri, her own breathing labored. I can, so long as you are under my guardianship. You really don't think this will save Peony, so don't pretend this is about her. She has days. The chances of them finding a cure before. Then my only mistake was in waiting too long to be rid of you, Adri said, running the washcloth between her fingers. Believe me, Cinder, you are a sacrifice I will never regret. The treads of one of the Medroids clattered against the carpet. Are you prepared to come with us? Cinder pursed her lips and lowered her hand from her face. She glared at Adri, but could find no sympathy in her stepmother's eyes. A new hatred boiled up inside her. Warning flashed in her vision. No, I'm not. Cinder swung the mag belt, smacking it so hard against the android's cranium. The robot fell to the floor, treads spinning midair. I won't go. Scientists have done enough to me already. The second android whirled toward her. Initiating procedure 240B, forcible removal of cyborg draft subject. Cinder sneered and shoved the end of the mag belt at the android's sensor, shattering the lens and thrusting it into its back. She spun around to face the last android, already thinking how she would run from the apartment, wondering if it would be too risky to call a hover, wondering where to find a knife for cutting out her ID chip, otherwise they'd be sure to track her, wondering if Eco would be fast enough to follow, wondering if her legs could follow her all the way to Europe. The Medroid approached too fast. She stumbled, changing directory of the mag belt, but the android's metal pinchers grasped her wrist first. Electrodes fired. Electricity sizzled through Cinder's nervous system. The voltage overwhelmed her wiring. Cinder's lips parted, but the cry stuck in the back of her throat. She dropped the mag belt and collapsed. Red warnings flashed across her vision until, in an act of cyborg self-preservation, her brain forced her to shut down. Chapter 7. Dr. Dmitri Erland dragged his finger across the port screen, scanning the patient's records. Male, 32 years old. He had a child, but no mention of a spouse. Unemployed. Turned cyborg after a debilitating work accident 3 years ago. No doubt spending most of his savings on the surgery. He traveled all the way from Tokyo. So many strikes against him, and Erland couldn't explain that to anybody. Sticking his tongue out between his teeth, he raspberried his disappointment. "What do you think, Doctor?" asked today's assistant, a dark-skinned girl whose name he could never recall and who was taller than he was by at least 4 inches. He liked to give her tasks that kept her seated while she worked. Dr. Erland filled his lungs slowly, then released them all at once, changing the display to the more relevant diagram of the patient's body. He had a mere 6.4% makeup, his right foot a bit of wiring, and a thumbnail-sized control panel embedded in his thigh. "Too old," he said, tossing the port out on the countertop before the observation window. On the other side of the glass, the patient was laid out on the lab table. He looked peaceful, but for madly tapping fingers against the plastic cushions. His feet were bare, but skin grafting covered the prosthesis. "Too old?" asked the assistant. She stood and came to his window, waving her own port screen at him. 32 is too old now? We can't use him." She bunched her lips to one side. "Doctor, this will be the 6th draft subject you've turned away this month. We can't afford to keep doing this. He has a child, a son. It says so right here. Yeah, a child who'll be able to afford dinner tonight because his dad was lucky enough to fit our profile." "To fit our profile with a 6.4% ratio? It's better than testing on people." She dropped the port screen beside a tray of petri dishes. "You really want to let him go?" Dr. Erland glared into the quarantine room, a growl humming in the back of his throat. Placing his shoulders back, he tugged down on his lab coat. "Placebo him." But he's not sick." "Yes, but if we don't give him anything, the Treasury will wonder what we're doing down here. Now give him a placebo and submit a report so he can be on his way." The girl huffed and went to grab a labeled vial from a shelf. "What are we doing down here?" Dr. Erland held up a finger, but the girl gave him such an irritated look that he forgot what he'd been about to say. "What's your name again?" She rolled her eyes. "Honestly, I've only been your assistant every day for the past 4 months." She turned her back on him, her long braid whipping against her hip. Dr. Erland's eyebrows drew together as he stared at the braid, watching as it wound itself up, curling in on itself. A shiny black snake rearing its head, hissing at him, ready to strike. He slammed his eyes shut and counted to 10. When he opened them again, the braid was just a braid. Shiny black hair, harmless. Pulling off his hat, Dr. Erland took a moment to rub his own hair, gray and considerably less full than his assistant's. His visions were getting worse. The door to the lab room opened. "Doctor?" He jolted and stuffed his head back into the hat. "Yes," he said, grabbing his port screen. Lee, another assistant, lingered with his hand on the doorknob. Dr. Erland always liked Lee, who was also tall, but not as tall as the girl. "There's a volunteer waiting in 6D, said Lee. "Someone they brought in last night." "A volunteer?" said the girl. "Been a while since we had one of those." Lee pulled a port screen from his breast pocket. She's young too, a teenager. "We haven't run her diagnostics yet, but I think she's going to have a pretty high ratio. No skin grafting." Dr. Erland perked up, scratching his temple with the corner of his port. "A teenage girl, you say? How?" He fumbled for an appropriate descriptor. "Unusual, coincidental, lucky?" "Suspicious," said the girl, her voice low. Dr. Erland turned, found her glower bearing down on him. "Suspicious? What do you mean?" "Just that you're always more than willing to placebo the male cyborgs that come in, but you perk right up when you catch word of a girl, especially the young ones." He opened his mouth, closed it, then started again. "The younger, the healthier," he said. "The healthier, the fewer complications we'll have, and it isn't my fault that the draft keeps picking on females." "Fewer complications, right? Either way, they're going to die." "Yes, well, thank you for your optimism." He gestured to the man on the other side of the glass. "Placebo, please. Come join us when you've finished." He stepped out of the lab room, Lee at his side, and cupped a hand around his mouth. "What is her name again?" "Fatine." "Fatine, I can never remember that. One of these days I'll be forgetting my own name." Lee chuckled, and Erland was glad he'd made the joke. People seemed to overlook an old man losing his mind as if People seemed to overlook an old man losing his mind as if he occasionally made light of it. The hallway was empty save for two medroids lingering by the stairwell, awaiting orders. It was a short walk to Library Room 6D. The doctor pulled a stylus from his ear and tapped at his port, downloading the information Lee had sent him. The new patient's profile popped up. Lynn Cinder, licensed mechanic, born 29th November 109 TE. 0 media hits. Resident of New Beijing, Eastern Commonwealth. Ward of Lynn Adri. Lee opened the door to the lab. Tucking the stylus back behind his ear, Dr. Erland entered the room with twitching fingers. The girl was lying on the table on the other side of the viewing window. The sterile quarantine room was so bright he had to squint into the glare. A medroid was just capping a plastic vial filled with blood and plunking it onto the chute, sending it off to the blood lab. The girl's hands and wrists had been fastened with metal bands. Her left hand was steel, tarnished and dark between the joints as if it needed a good cleaning. Her pant legs had been rolled up to her calves, revealing one human leg and one synthetic. Is she plugged in yet? He asked, slipping his port into his coat pocket. Not yet, said Lee. But look at her. Dr. Erland grunted, staving off his disappointment. Yes, her ratio should be impressive. But it's not the best quality, is it? Not the exterior, maybe, but you should have seen her wiring. Auto control and full-grade nervous system. Dr. Erland quirked an eyebrow, then lowered it just as fast. Has she been unruly? The medroids had trouble apprehending her. She disabled two of them with a belt or something before they were able to shock her system. She's been out all night. But she volunteered. Her legal guardian did. She suspects the patient has already had contact with the disease, a sister taken yesterday. Dr. Erland pulled a microphone across the desk. Wakey, wakey, sleeping beauty, he sang, rapping on the glass. They stunned her with 200 volts, said Lee, but I expect her to be coming around any minute now. Dr. Erland hooked his thumb on his coat pockets. Well, we don't need consciousness. Let's go ahead and get started. Oh, good, Bettine said in the doorway. Her heels clipped against the tile floor as she entered the lab room. Glad you found one to suit your taste. Dr. Erland pressed a finger to the glass. Young, he said, eyeing the metallic sheen of the girl's limbs. Healthy. With a sneer, Bettine claimed a seat before a net screen that projected the cyborg's records. If 32 is old and decrepit, what does that make you, old man? Very valuable in the antique market. Dr. Erland lowered his lips to the mic. Med, ready the radio detector, if you please. Ratio detector. Chapter 8. She was lying on a burning pyre, hot coals beneath her back. Flames, smoke, blisters burbling against her skin. Her leg and hand were gone, leaving stumps where the surgeons had attached her prosthesis. Dead wires dangled from them. She tried to crawl, but was as useless as you pinned a turtle. She reached out with her one hand, trying to drag her body from the fire, but the bed of coals stretched off into the horizon. She'd had this dream before, 100 times. This time, though, it was different. Instead of being all alone, like usual, she was surrounded. Other crippled victims writhed on the coals, moaning, begging for water. They were all missing limbs. Some were nothing more than a head and torso and a mouth, pleading. Cinder shrank away from them, noticing bluish spots on their skin. Their necks, their stumpy thighs, their shriveled wrists. She saw Peony, screaming, accusing Cinder. She had done all this to her. She had brought the plague to their household. It was all her fault. Cinder opened her mouth to beg for forgiveness, but she stopped when she caught sight of her one good hand. Her skin was covered in blue spots. The fire began to melt the diseased skin away, revealing metal and wires beneath the flesh. She met Peony's gaze again, and her sister opened her mouth but her voice sounded awkward, deep. Ready the ratio detector, if you please. The words hummed like bees in Cinder's ears. Her body jolted, but she couldn't move. Her limbs were too heavy. The smell of smoke lingered in her nostrils, but the heat from the flames was dying away, leaving only her sore burning back. Peony faded away. The pit of coals melted into the ground. Green text scrolled along the bottom corner of Cinder's vision. Beyond the darkness, she heard the familiar rumble of android treads. Eco? Diagnostics check complete. All systems stabilized. Rebooting in 3, 2, 1. Something clattered above her head. The hum of electricity. Cinder felt her finger twitch, the closest thing to a flinch her body was capable of. The darkness began to warm, a subtle crimson brightness beyond her eyes. She forced her eyes open, squinting into the harsh fluorescence. Ah, she awakens. She shut her eyes again, let them adjust. She tried to bring her hand up to cover them, but something had her locked in place. Panic raced along her nerves. She opened her eyes again and turned her head, straining to see who had spoken. A mirror filled the wall. Her own face stared wild-eyed back at her. Her ponytail was a mess. Her skin was pale too, as if the voltage had drained her of more than energy. They'd taken her gloves and her boots and rolled her pant legs up. She was not looking at a girl in the mirror. She was looking at a machine. "How are you feeling, Miss Lynn?" said a disembodied voice in an accent she couldn't pinpoint. European? American? She wet her parched lips and craned her head to peer at the android behind her. It was fidgeting with a small machine on the countertop amid a dozen others. Medical equipment, surgical toys, IVs, needles. Cinder realized she was attached to one of the machines by wired sensors on her chest and forehead. A net screen hung on the wall to her right, displaying her name and ID number. Otherwise, the room was empty. "If you will just hold still and cooperate, we won't take up too much of your time," said the voice. Cinder scowled. "Very funny," she said, forcibly straining against the metal bands. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't volunteer for your stupid tests." A silence. Something beeped behind her. Peering overhead, she saw the android pulling two prongs attached to thin cables out of a machine. A chill crawled up her spine. "Keep that thing away from me. This won't hurt a bit, Miss Lynn. I don't care. Stay out of my head. I'm not one of your volunteers." The voice clucked. "I have a signature here from a Miss Lynn Adry. You must know her." "She's not my mother. She's just—" Her heart lurched. "Your legal guardian?" Cinder thumped her head against the padded exam table. "This isn't right." "Don't fret, Miss Lynn. You are doing your fellow citizens a great service by being here." "Yeah, and what'd they ever do for me?" Instead of answering, he said simply, "Med, please proceed." Treads wheeled toward her. Cinder jerked away, twisting her neck in an effort to avoid the cold prongs. But the android gripped her scalp with a mechanical strength and forced her right cheek to the tissue paper. She thrashed her arms, but it was useless. Perhaps if she fought hard enough, they would knock her out again. She wasn't sure if that would be better or worse, but the memory of the pit of burning embers halted her struggling. Her heart galloped as the android undid the latch in the back of her head. She shut her eyes, trying to imagine herself anywhere but this cold, sterile room. She didn't want to think about the two metal prongs being inserted into her control panel, her brain, but it was impossible not to think about it as she heard them being maneuvered into place. Nausea. She swallowed back the bile. She heard the click of the prongs. She couldn't feel anything, there were no nerve endings, but a shudder ripped through her, sending goosebumps on her arms. Her retina display informed her that she was now connected to ratio detector 2.3. Scanning 2%, 7%, 16%. The machine hummed on the table behind her. Cinder imagined a subtle current of electricity slipping along her wires. She felt it mostly where the skin joined with metal, a tingle where the blood had been cut off. 63%. Cinder clenched her jaw. Someone had been there before, in her head. A fact never forgotten, always ignored. Some surgeon, some stranger, opening her skull and inserting their made-up system of wires while she lay helplessly beneath them. Someone had altered her brain. Someone had altered her. 78%. She choked up on the scream that tried to bubble out of her. It was painless, but someone was in her head, inside of her. She tried to jerk away, but the android held her firm. "Get out!" The scream echoed back up to her off the cold walls. Scan completed. The medroid disconnected the prongs. Cinder lay trembling, her heart crushed against her ribcage. The medroid didn't bother to close the panel in the back of her head. Cinder hated it, hated Adri, hated the mad voice behind the mirror, hated the nameless people who had turned her into this. "Thank you for that stellar cooperation," said the disembodied voice. It'll take just a minute to record your cyberkinetic makeup, and then we'll proceed. Please make yourself comfortable." Cinder ignored him, face turning away from the mirror. It was one of those rare moments she was glad to have no tear ducts. Otherwise she was sure she'd be a sniveling disaster, and would have hated herself more for it. She could still hear voices over the speakers, but their words consisted of muttered scientific lingo she didn't understand. The Medroid was bustling around behind her, putting the ratio detector away, readying the next instrument of torture. Cinder opened her eyes. The net screen on the wall had changed, no longer showing her life stats. Her ID number was still at the top, headlining a holographic diagram of a girl full of wires. It was as if someone had chopped her down the middle, dividing her front half from her back half, then put her cartoonish image into a medical textbook. Her heart, brain, intestines, muscles, blue veins. Her control panel, her synthetic hand and leg. Wires that trailed from the base of her skull all the way down to her spine and out to her prosthetic limbs. The scar tissue where flesh met metal. A small dark square in her wrist. Her ID chip. But those things she had known. She'd expected. She had not known about the metal vertebrae lining her spine, of the 4 metal ribs, or the synthetic tissue around her heart, or the metal splints along the bones in her right leg. The bottom of the screen was labeled ratio 63.28%. She was 63% not human. "Thank you for your patience," came the voice, startling her. "As you've no doubt noticed, you are quite the model of modern science, young lady." "Leave me alone," she whispered. "What's going to happen next is that the Medroid is going to inject you with a 1/10 solution of leishmaniasis microbes. They've been magnetically tagged and so will appear bright green on the holographic diagram in real time. Once your body enters into the first stage of the disease, your immune system will kick in and try to destroy the microbes, but it will fail. Your body will then proceed to stage 2 of the disease, which is of course where we see the bruise-like spots on your skin. At that point, we will inject you with our most recent batch of antibodies, which, if we've succeeded, will permanently disable the pathogens. Abracadabra, you'll be home in time for dumplings. Are you ready?" Cinder stared at the holograph and imagined watching herself die, in real time. "How many batches of micro antibodies have you gone through?" 27. "But," said the foreign voice, "they die a little slower each time." Cinder crinkled the tissue paper beneath her fingertips. "I will leave it ready. Please proceed with syringe A." Something clattered on the table, and the android was beside her. A panel was open in its torso, revealing a third arm ending in a syringe, like those in the emergency androids. Cinder tried to pull away, but she had nowhere to go. Imagining the headless voice on the other side of the mirror, watching, laughing at her vain struggles, she froze and tried her best to hold still, to be strong, to not think about what they were doing to her. The android's palms were cold as they gripped Cinder's elbow, still bruised from having blood taken twice in the past 12 hours. She grimaced, muscles pulling taut into her bones. "It's easier to find the vein if you're relaxed," said the android. Cinder tensed her arm muscles until they were shaking. A snort came through the speakers, as if the disembodied voice was amused by her antics. The android was well programmed, however. Despite her rebellion, the needle punctured her vein on the first try. Cinder gasped. A pinch, just a pinch. The fight drained out of her as the clear liquid ran in. Alright, we've reached book 2, so we're going to stop there for now. I'll see you guys next time.